Thank you, everybody. And now we move to our first opening keynote speech. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Jean Lockwood. Okay, so I think you are familiar with her and her work. And let me just quickly introduce her. She's currently adjunct professor and member of the Research Center for Professional Communication in English at PolyU. And her key research area is how technology is impacting workplace communication. And she has published widely on this topic in the business processing outsourcing industry in Asia. And she has most recently co-authored a course book for business communication with Neil Ellis, Developing Business Communication in Asia, a simulated case study approach. And I would also like to mention that she is co-founder of the TAW Symposium with our former colleague, Dr. Gil Forey. And she's also one of the main organizers of this symposium. Okay, so thank you, Jen. And the title of her talk is Shifts in TAWE and Shifts in Language Exchange at Global Workplaces. So now over to you, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, good. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, everybody. It's always the photos that get in the way of the clock. So I intend to talk for about 30 minutes. And it's wonderful to be here yet again, talking across the world in English. And what I'm going to be looking at today is looking at the shifts in talking across the world over the years, because it was 2005 we had our first conference. Together with shifts in language exchange at global workplaces in general, because the mission, if you like, of talking across the world has substantially changed over the years. The first talking across the world was a result of a technological tsunami, where almost 20 years ago, I was down in Manila following hot on the heels of Eric. Actually, I think we were consultants at the same third-party call center at one stage. And I got very interested in the BPO industry in the late 90s, where work was being outsourced and offshored from countries such as US and UK to developing countries such as Philippines, India, and South America. It was at that stage primarily customer service contact centers that were mushrooming up, but there was a little bit of medical diagnosis and transcriptions, legal and financial advising and healthcare counseling that were being offshored and outsourced for obvious sort of financial reasons, but the companies always claimed that there were huge improvements in quality issues, as well as it was normally graduates in these developing countries that took these jobs. Up until 2019, the last time, unfortunately, that I was in the Philippines, there were over 1 million contact center seats in the Philippines. And the challenges in 2005 in Manila were really very clear. It was to bring industry managers and practitioners together to problematize issues. We didn't want industry saying what a great job they were doing. We, as applied linguists and educationalists, were very interested in listening to the kind of problems and challenges they had, getting in there, rolling up our sleeves, doing the research and providing practical solutions that we thought worked better than some of the practices that were going on in the contact center industries at that time. And these challenges related to recruitment and to the assessment practices. For example, in recruitment in a contact center that I was doing some consulting work in, they read tongue twisters. And if the Filipinos got more than 6 errors in the tongue twisters, they didn't get a job. There were very reductionist, very poorly informed assessment practices going on. And surprise, surprise, they got very few people recruited into the contact center industry. Pre-employment training was also a problem, where you had these siloed events going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Huge resources being pumped into training, where in one room you'd have grammar sheets being distributed, in another classroom you'd have accent neutralization going on, in another classroom you'd have downloads that were termed intercultural training, and then you would have soft skills training that was completely disassociated from the communications training that was going on. So a lot of resources wasted, a lot of time wasted. There was also a lot of stuff going on the job. Typically, contact center would employ lots of quality assurance specialists that would go around and listen to people on the floor, and then retrain them. Unfortunately, these people were in the main not linguists, not educationalists, and there was a lot of time wasted, but that's another story. Management practices were also something that we started to look at in terms of language policy, scripting, and the quality assurance practices. A lot of scripting industries started up and made huge claims about they could solve the problem that the contact center agent had when they were dealing with, for example, an angry customer. Problem is they only had one side of the story there. And then the tsunami, technological tsunami, keeps coming as it is today. And over the last decade, the more recent themes that we've been looking at have been in the BPO, artificial intelligence and automation, and the first rise of virtual assistants, where 89% of the workers in the BPO industry will experience change related to artificial intelligence. And here we have this wonderful image of artificial interfacing with human. But there was a need for higher cognitive skills, and this was good news for the BPO industry, where social and emotional skills, leadership, and advanced technological skills were even in higher demand. The challenges to the BPO 5 years ago were human agents now needed to work with virtual agents in the same customer space. So, for example, how do they interface where you have the handoff from the virtual agent to the human agent? There was a lot of communication breaking down, as you can imagine, and as you have probably experienced yourself. You think you're talking to a robot, you are talking to a robot, they can't do anything for you, and then the human agent comes on. They usually get an earful. Virtual agents need to be better and more polite and more adaptive, was what one American bank said to us when we were doing some work in Hyderabad. So there was a need for applied linguistic research to tweak the existing algorithms that are out there. And this is a huge contribution that we can make as applied linguists to the development of artificial intelligence. But also at this time, there was a broader application of the improved technology, where virtual teams in global communication were emerging more and more with mergers and acquisitions. And the development of bespoke technical platforms, Zooms, Teams, etc., from management and participant point of views, were all feeding in to virtual business communication. And then another tsunami came. And this tsunami was the 2019 COVID tsunami, as we call it. Technology accelerated everywhere, at work, at school, and at play. And everybody was operating from a device. Talking Across the World in 2020 and 2021 broadened further and we explored how work from home, work from school, and play at home were all being impacted by the new technology. We looked broadly at remote management communication. We looked at the phenomenon of Zoom, Slack, Teams fatigue, and we looked at private and public divide, where technology is in your living room, is in your kitchen, and is in your bedroom. And what about the post-COVID wash-up in 2022? And I think that it is still washing up. I think there are still things that we're grappling with that have a huge implications for communication. So what are the big questions washing up? Technology continues to accelerate. We have physical contact, we have work from home, we have school from home, we have remote and virtual, a mixture of both hybrid working and hybrid schooling. And at the same time, 5G technology is advancing at great speed. And of course, not to mention the Metaverse, which is the next technological tsunami. And for those of you like me that have had a difficulty in sort of getting your head around the definition, the Metaverse is essentially a merging of virtual, augmented, and physical reality, and it blurs the line between your interactions on life and real life. Just think for a minute about the implications of that for identity and communication. Late last year, Microsoft unveiled its Mesh for Microsoft Teams solution that will bring virtual avatars and holograms to its popular enterprise video conferencing platform next year. So next year, we may all be joining with virtual glasses. We might be selecting our mini personas for our avatars for talking across the world. And next year, we may be working in the Metaverse. We might be sending personalized avatars to work in a virtual space. However, this is enough speculation. Let's get back to where we are in Talking Across the World 2022. We are here, but we need to keep very much in mind what is coming down the line in more technological tsunamis. What are the key success factors in global business communication now? This was a question posed earlier this year by an American business services provider whom I will call Contact, a young company founded in 2017 with 63,000 employees operating across 22 countries. In 2021, they were voted the best employer for diversity. The business comprises medical billing, patient support services, and diagnostics. I was working with a team coming out of Hyderabad. They asked me the question for the purposes of a global seminar they wanted me to run. How can we ensure communication does not break down within our global organization where the lingua franca is English? And their current business communication issues were, we're mostly virtual and digital. We are young and diverse, culturally and linguistically. We are geographically scattered with little travel for the foreseeable future. So what was I to say? I mean, having gone to most of the most recent applied linguistic research and education research, I turned to the business management research, and someone called Professor Teasdale Neely has written a great deal about technology and communication. So I dipped into some of her work. She's a professor at the Harvard Business School. Notably one called The Remote Work Revolution, How to Succeed from Anywhere. and The Digital Mindset, both published by the Harvard Business School. She presented the two-dimensional model that we're all familiar with, the physical and the virtual. And at the moment in 2022, we're stuck with either or. Some businesses are saying you have to come back to work. Other businesses are saying you don't have to come back to work, you can work from home. Many businesses are somewhere in the middle where they're proposing 3-day weeks and some form of hybridity. So we're stuck in this two-dimensional world. We're stuck in sort of a lack of industry analysis, because clearly some need to be more physical than virtual, and some will work and thrive in the hybrid model. But what are the current challenges of hybridity? And she had 3 things to say. First of all, get the technology right and develop a digital mindset. She's got a close eye on the Metaverse. It's going to continue to develop. It won't go away. Secondly, develop best virtual communication practices, like bring your laptops to virtual meetings, and says rather holistically, develop new skills in language and cultural exchange, which is where we come in. And thirdly, articulate the rules of engagement. And I'm going to be touching on this a little bit later, where I talk about one of the case studies. I proposed with Contact that I would talk about a couple of case studies. And the first case study draws on one of Professor Neely's research projects that was published, called The Language of Global Success. This was around a Japanese company that was operating across the globe. It was a 5-year longitudinal study. It involved, it was called Rakuten, that's a pseudonym, a Japanese company. They did online retail specialisms, and they were founded by an American-born Japanese businessman, Hiroshi Mikitani, in Japan. They had global presence across US, Thailand, and many parts of Asia. He posed himself the question, how do I make Rakuten a truly global company where everybody can communicate with each other? And he did 2 rather bold things. He implemented a very explicit English language policy, and he implemented a very explicit Japanese business culture policy. The process had its ups and downs, as you would expect, and I would invite you to get hold of a copy of the process and the procedures in this language of global success. I'm not going to spend time looking at the process, but you can imagine some of the ups and downs. But I am going to look at the findings, because I think this tells us something about where we're heading. So the Rakuten workforce is divided into 3. The Japanese workforce that Neely called the linguistic expats. And previously, for those of you that have been to Japan, you know that there are quite low levels of English. And in this company, there was a bilingual team who were very busy. They now had to demonstrate adequate TOEIC levels within a time frame and were annually appraised. After all the blood, sweat and tears, within 5 years, this sector became more globally mobile, got promotions, and they disbanded their bilingual colleagues. And then there was the American workforce that Neely called the cultural expats. They assumed L1 levels of English, put them in a very favorable position. They were delighted, and they also assumed with this, erroneously, that they would continue to experience an American open work and flat work culture. But now they needed to change. And she describes the Japanese business culture, omenatashi, where hierarchy, social conformity, loyalty, hard work were all expected. This American group found the change the hardest, where their US identities were challenged by these new Japanese business cultural norms. And then there was the other Asian and European workforce, what I call the linguistic and cultural expats. These were second language speakers, but using English as a lingua franca, and they were second culture employees. And they were found to be the most adept at language accommodation and cultural adaptability. At the end of the day, this group were the winners. Now, intercultural adaptability, as we all know, is now enshrined in corporate mission statements around diversity and equality and so forth. We all need to adapt. No culture is preeminent. And for language accommodation, this is an increasingly important part of language success. And I think we have in attendance today Carol Yu, who has just completed a PhD in language accommodation, supervised by Hans Landegaard, and both experts in this area. However, for those of you that aren't part of the department, what are the language accommodation strategies that have been researched? For example, for the stronger speakers, and here just a list of them: slow down, tenacity, restructure, standardize, rephase, uncontract, topic fronting, no interruption or overlap, familiar feedback cues, let it pass if it's not important, make it normal, check understanding, offer help, and silence toleration. These are things that many of us do naturally, but these are things that can be learned. And what are the language accommodation strategies of the weaker speakers? Because it is a two-way communication issue. We have literal translation and switch, as well as translanguaging. They're not the same thing, I know, but word coinage, approximation, appeal for assistance, lexical copying, topic avoidance. And what are the language strategies for both L1 and 2? Well, here's some: repeat words and sentences, abandon message, topic avoidance, and lexical copying. They're all things we need to be much more conscious of and train ourselves to do. The case study 2, which I also talked to Contact about, was related to a Shanghai software team that was communicating virtually with a US client. This was a publication that Frank Song and I did in 2016. Dr. Song, well, I examined Dr. Song's PhD, and he had a lot of unused data there. So we decided to look at the issue of accommodation in a series of recorded virtual meetings. So the aim was to explore the specific issue of accommodation in the IT virtual team exchanges between US and Chinese IT engineers from 5 virtual recordings. The context of the study was as follows. There was a major Chinese-based IT service and software development, and we'll call them ChineTech. ChineTech provides IT services in its offshore development centers for the US and European markets, and consists of offshore project teams working together with their client onshore project teams. And this is done through regular teleconferences. This particular project was very high stakes, as it had previously failed, was being implemented by a US client, which we'll call Travel Time in the study, and they were developing a new travel platform for its customers. There was a great deal of pressure on both sides to ensure a quick and efficient completion at high quality. As I mentioned earlier, it had failed previously. The issue was the Chine-Tech team had very low levels of spoken English, round about a CFR A2. The data analysis came from the recordings of 5 virtual meetings. These were transcribed and analyzed. We identified and coded the use of intratextual accommodation strategies or language accommodation strategies in the linguistic scripts using existing frameworks of accommodation. But we also decided to select and analyze strategies that were sitting outside the language, but scaffolding it, which was sensitive to the overall context. And we called these extra-textual accommodation strategies. So what are extra-textual accommodation strategies? Well, if we think back to Professor Neely, these were strategies where you really had to articulate the terms of engagement. You're virtual now. We don't have the affordance of face-to-face. So these have really become extremely important in the virtual communication we do now. Wilcox and all talked about this as a governance charter, governing virtual projects where relationships, structures and roles, who in each party is responsible for what, the importance of planning meetings and agendas, who will gather together about what and how often, the reviews, who will assess and how often, issue management, how problems and ideas for improvement will be raised, tracked and resolved, and the same for dispute management and variation management, how these will be raised, tracked and resolved. The findings from this study was that despite the very low levels of English in the Chinese team, and of course non-existent Chinese in the American team, there were very few instances of communication breakdown in the analyzed data. And why was this? Dr. Song and I decided that it seemed from the data there was much more going on than just the intratextual or language accommodation strategies. There was also extra-textual accommodation strategies going on, and they seemed to be working rather well together. So the extra-textual accommodation strategies that we found in this study was that although there was no formal charter, there were rules of engagement, and they had been articulated at the beginning of the project to the Chine-Tech group, as well as their onshore group. And that was the use of what they call daily bug reports, where the Chine-Tech team would talk about the problems they were having. There was a selection of Lehigh as a Chine-Tech spokesperson. He was Chinese, but he had had experience in Germany working in a project team. Although his English wasn't good, it was better than the rest of the team. There were daily teleconferences at the same time. The meetings were confined to 20 minutes. They were agreed and they were formatted in exactly the same way. So if you do a little genre analysis, it started with greetings, although very brief, report back by Chine-Tech team with the bug reports, evaluation and allocation by the travel time team, and there were new tasks given, and then a closing. There was backup technology, email, if communication was very difficult, and there was always a post-meeting debrief. The intratextual accommodation strategies findings were that these were some of the accommodation strategies that came up regularly. There was limited small talk, so there was topic avoidance. This was very transactional rather than interactional, and we can reflect on that at some later stage. but there was no social chit chat at the beginning of each of the meetings because that may jeopardize communication and understanding. There was a lot of slowdown. There was a lot of restructure, standardizing and rephrasing. There was no interruption or overlap, so those genre moves were almost sacrosanct. And there was a lot of checking understanding and asking for repetition. So as I say, it was very transactional rather than interactional. And here's an example of checking understanding in language accommodation, where Rajesh, who is an American-born Indian, said, Lehigh, so what Mark said, do you understand every bit of it? Sorry, you mean, did I understand what Mark said? Yeah, I understand. Mark wants, oh, okay, this should have something done on the booking 3 for the, I did. Lehigh, can you tell me what you're going to do today? Oh, okay, we will do some designs for booking 3, change to pressing. Okay, I don't want you to do that again. Okay, I want you to do 2 things. First, let me tell you what you need to do. So the first thing is, so these were very, very prevalent in the data that we saw. So the key finding, the most striking finding in this study, has been to see how the use of both extra and intratextual accommodation strategies work together to facilitate the success of communication at these virtual team meetings. There appears to be a symbiotic relationship between the 2 kinds of strategies, where the meeting format and supporting bug reports were scaffolding the linguistic exchange and thereby mitigating communication breakdown. So the implications for virtual communication success, just getting back to contact and their concerns about mitigating global business communication breakdown, was to talk about, well, what are the rules of engagement for virtual projects and meetings? We don't have the affordance of face-to-face now, so we need to be much more explicit in the way we organize our communication. And as part of that charter, make language policy explicit. It doesn't have to be all English, but there needs to be a language policy. And it's very clear that native speakers are no longer privileged in global communication exchanges. We all have a lot to learn. Everyone needs to develop new sets of language and intercultural skills for global work. As L1 speakers, we need to be much more aware of our ability to use language accommodation and our ability to culturally adapt. Our ongoing challenges of applied linguists are, of course, access to workplaces and schools. It's great to have today people from the school and education sector now part of talking across the world. And we need more data. We need to get in there and see what's happening in education. We need interdisciplinary partnerships. As Eric quite rightly said, we're an interdisciplinary department. We need to form more interdisciplinary partnerships and be in touch with our business management colleagues, for example. And we need to keep developing a digital mindset and keep up with the metaverse. It's going to be there, and it has huge implications for us as applied linguists. We all have a lot to contribute from applied linguistics, and we have been a bit of a discipline that has hidden our light under a bush. So I hope that in forming these partnerships, we're able to really contribute to what's going on in technology and communication. And today's papers will all be contributing in more depth to some of these issues raised in the opening address. So thank you, and I'll see you in the universe.